Walter Higgins had been sitting on the same bench in Riverside Park for 11 years, and he had never once considered that a Tuesday afternoon could turn dangerous. The bench sat beneath a broad oak near the eastern path, close enough to the walking trail to feel part of things, far enough to feel private. He came most afternoons around 4, a paperback western tucked under one arm, a bag of stale bread in the other, and settled in for an hour of feeding pigeons and reading chapters he'd already read a dozen times before. His wife Doris used to tease him about rereading the same 6 books until the spines cracked. She'd been gone 6 years now, and Walter had kept the habit going, partly out of comfort and partly because the alternative, an empty apartment at 4 in the afternoon, felt like more silence than he wanted to sit inside of. The late afternoon light came gold and soft through the oak leaves, the specific warm slant of a September sun, not yet ready to give up the day. Walter had just cracked the paperback open to chapter 11 when he heard them coming. 5 sets of footsteps, loud in the particular way teenagers are loud when they want to be noticed. Laughter that had an edge to it he recognized immediately from 2 previous encounters. Not again, he thought, and felt his stomach do the small, familiar drop of a man who understood, correctly, that he had no real way to defend himself against 5 16-year-olds. They circled slow at first, casual, performing carelessness for whatever audience existed in their own minds. A boy at the front, the one the others seemed to orbit, already had his phone up and recording. Walter kept his eyes on his book, the specific defensive strategy of an old man who had learned that not engaging sometimes made things end faster. It didn't work this time. The ringleader, Marcus, though Walter didn't know his name, snatched the paperback right out of his hands, held it up over his head, out of reach, grinning at his friends for approval. "Give it back, please," Walter said. His voice came out smaller than he wanted it to. Not pleading exactly, just asking. The way you ask when asking is the only tool left in the box. They didn't give it back. 30 feet down the path, a large man in a company polo shirt, moving in storage, stitched in blue thread across the chest, had stopped walking. Alan Smith had walked this exact route home from work nearly every weekday for 3 years. The last mile of a long day spent lifting furniture and navigating stairwells, a habit that had less to do with scenery and more to do with the specific decompression his body and mind needed before he could walk through his own front door and be simply a man relaxing at home rather than a man carrying the entire day's physical weight in his shoulders. He'd seen the group before, in smaller versions of this exact scene, and had kept walking each time, telling himself it wasn't his business. That old man on the bench probably had a family who'd sort it out. That inserting himself into things uninvited rarely went the way a person hoped it would. He had spent 8 years building a life around exactly that kind of restraint, around minding his own business, staying small, staying quiet, letting other people's problems remain other people's problems. He was 30 seconds from walking past this one too. He didn't. He'd walked this path every day for 3 years without incident. He was 30 seconds from just walking past this one too. He didn't. If something about this moment already has your attention, if you can feel what's about to happen, hit the like button right now. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we tell stories like this one every single week. Drop your country in the comments and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Now, let's understand exactly who Alan Smith is and what it's already cost him to become this quiet. That morning had started the way most of Alan's mornings started. Early, physical, entirely unremarkable to anyone watching. He'd arrived at the moving company depot at 6, checking the day's manifest with his crew, a 3-bedroom relocation across town that would take most of the day. He carried a dresser down 3 flights of stairs with the specific careful economy of a man who had never once, in 8 years on the job, dropped something or scuffed a wall. A co-worker, watching him lift a couch frame like it weighed nothing, joked that Alan must have been some kind of athlete once. Something like that, Alan said, and changed the subject. The practiced ease of a man who had spent 8 years redirecting exactly this kind of attention away from himself. Before dawn that same morning, before the depot, before the crew, Alan had been somewhere nobody at the moving company knew existed. A rented storage unit on the industrial side of town, a heavy bag hanging from a reinforced beam in the rafters, no gloves, no mirror, no audience of any kind. He wrapped his hands in silence. Through a combination, jab, cross, hook, the kind of fluid, terrifying precision that took 2 decades to build and 8 years of quiet, disciplined maintenance to keep from disappearing entirely. He stopped after 12 minutes, breathed, unwrapped his hands, locked the unit, and drove to work. Nobody knew about this room. Nobody at the depot, nobody in his apartment building, nobody who had watched him carry furniture for 8 years had any reason to imagine what those hands had once been capable of, or what discipline it took every single morning to keep that capability sharp while promising himself he would never again need to use it against another human being. 8 years earlier, in a different city, under bright arena lights, a referee had raised Alan's arm in victory. His 22nd professional win, undefeated. A fighter promoters were already circling for a title run. The image lasted only a second in Alan's memory before it cut, sharp and unwelcome, to a different image entirely. A hospital hallway, fluorescent lights, Alan sitting alone outside a closed door with his head in his hands, waiting for news he already suspected he wasn't going to like. He did not let himself sit in that memory for long. He never did. He finished his shift, said goodnight to his crew, and started walking his usual route home through Riverside Park. The same time, the same path. An entirely ordinary Tuesday that was about to become the opposite of ordinary. Alan crossed the last 30 feet to the bench at an unhurried pace, the specific measured walk of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and felt no need to rush getting there. "That's not yours," he said to Marcus. Calm, not loud. He extended one hand, palm up, open. Not a demand, just presence. Marcus laughed it off, glancing at his friends to confirm they were watching the specific bravado of a 16-year-old who has never once had to back down in front of an audience he cares about. "Mind your business, old man. He's not bothering anybody," Alan said, nodding toward Walter, whose hands had gone still in his lap, his eyes moving between the boys and this new, larger presence, with an expression caught somewhere between hope and fresh alarm. "Give him his book back and you can go." The group's attention pivoted entirely, the specific way a pack redirects when a more interesting confrontation presents itself. Walter was instantly forgotten. Alan was now the subject. Marcus, embarrassed in front of his friends at being told what to do by a stranger, tossed the paperback aside deliberately, into the dirt near the path, and stepped closer to Alan with the specific exaggerated swagger of someone trying to look bigger than he felt. "Or what?" Alan didn't answer immediately. He simply stepped sideways, placing his own body between the group and Walter's bench. Not a fighting stance, nothing aggressive in it at all, just quiet, deliberate positioning, the specific geometry of a man who has decided where he intends to stand and is not going to be moved from it easily. Walter, hands trembling slightly, bent down and retrieved his book from the dirt, brushing it off, and started to rise from the bench. "Sit down, Walter," Alan said, gently, without looking away from the 5 teenagers now fully focused on him. "I've got this." Walter didn't know how Alan knew his name. He'd never introduced himself to this stranger, had in fact never spoken to him before in his life. But something in the specific calm certainty of the sentence made him sit back down without questioning it. The 5 teens closed in around Alan, not immediately violent but crowding. The specific physical intimidation of numbers pressed against a single target. Phones now up and filming from 3 separate angles. The particular energy of an audience that senses something is about to happen and doesn't want to miss recording it. Someone shoved Alan's shoulder from behind. He absorbed the impact without moving his feet, without raising his hands, without giving any visible reaction beyond a slight shift of weight to reabsorb his own balance. "You gonna do something?" Marcus said, close now, performing hard for the cameras, his voice pitched to carry. "No," Alan said, even, unhurried. "I'm going to stand here until you all decide to leave." The response, the specific, unnerving calm of it, the total absence of fear or anger in his voice, landed strangely with the group, not as reassuring, but as somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been. One of the teens laughed uncomfortably, the specific nervous laughter of someone who doesn't fully understand why they're nervous. Another shoved Alan again, harder this time, hard enough to actually move him half a step. 30 feet away, on a walk that had started later than his usual morning schedule because of a doctor's appointment that ran long, Frank Delgado had stopped completely, phone already half raised, his thumb hovering over the call button. 3 decades spent inside boxing arenas and gymnasiums had given him a very specific, very reliable instinct for recognizing the exact moment a tense situation was about to turn into a dangerous one, and every part of that instinct was firing now. He started moving closer, still too far to intervene physically, close enough to see clearly. The 15-year-old at the edge of the group, the one who had said the least, the one most desperate to prove something to Marcus and the others. The specific dangerous combination of insecurity and audience that makes teenagers do things alone they would never consider doing individually, stepped forward suddenly, and swung. Right here. Before you see what happens next, subscribe if you haven't already, because the next 30 seconds are the entire reason this story exists. Hit the bell. Drop your country in the comments. We're reading every single one. Now, watch closely. The punch came fast, wild, untrained. The specific, dangerous unpredictability of an amateur swing thrown by someone running almost entirely on adrenaline rather than any actual skill. For 1 full second, everything the park had learned about this quiet, unhurried stranger collided with everything anyone might reasonably fear could happen next. He had absorbed shoves. He had absorbed insults, mockery, 5 teenagers closing a circle around him with cameras raised. He had stood there, visibly, deliberately restrained, through all of it. This was different. This was a closed fist, coming directly at his face, with real, if clumsy, intent. Alan's body responded before his conscious mind had fully caught up to what was happening. 8 years of retirement, 8 years of storage unit discipline and quiet restraint, could not erase 2 decades of trained reflex, built into muscle and nerve, at a level deeper than decision-making. His left hand rose in a fraction of a second, caught the boy's wrist at the exact angle textbook technique required, redirected the momentum past his own body rather than absorbing it, and a single controlled sweep of his leg put the teenager on the ground. Not slammed, not struck, simply and completely off balance and down. The specific, precise difference between a trained fighter controlling an outcome and a trained fighter hurting someone. The boy hit the grass hard enough to knock the wind from him, hard enough to frighten him badly, but he was unhurt, shocked, humiliated in front of his friends in a completely different way than he'd imagined 30 seconds earlier. But unhurt. The park went completely silent. Even the birds, it seemed, had gone quiet. Alan stood exactly where he had been standing before the punch was thrown, his hands already lowering back to his sides in the same unhurried rhythm they had held the entire encounter, his breathing entirely unchanged, no elevated heart rate visible in his posture, no adrenaline spike written across his face. He looked down at the boy on the ground, and his expression carried something that was not triumph at all. It was something closer to grief, the specific, private horror of a man realizing that his body had just done, in the smallest and most controlled and most fully justified version imaginable, the exact thing he had promised himself 8 years ago he would never let it do again. For half a second, he had not been entirely sure it wouldn't be more than that. Frank Delgado had reached the edge of the scene by the time the boy hit the ground. He had seen the entire sequence, not merely the takedown itself, which anyone watching could recognize as controlled and restrained, but the specific footwork underneath it, the exact weight distribution through the hips, the precise economy of motion that 3 decades spent around elite fighters had trained into his eye at a level so deep it now operated almost involuntarily, faster than conscious recognition. He was already speaking before he'd fully processed what he was saying, the name arriving in his mouth before his mind had finished confirming it. "Smith," he said, quietly, mostly to himself. Then, louder, turning toward the small crowd of onlookers that had gathered along the path and the visibly shaken group of teenagers still clustered nearby, his voice carrying the specific, unhurried authority of a man who had spent 30 years being the person whose word was trusted in exactly this kind of moment. "That's Alan Smith, Iron Wall Smith." Nobody in the immediate crowd reacted at first. The name meant nothing to most of them, a piece of boxing history that had faded from public memory the moment Alan walked away from it 8 years earlier. But Frank kept talking, moving closer, unwilling to let the moment settle into confusion when he had the exact information to resolve it. "I refereed his fights. 22-0. He could have gone to a world title." He looked directly at Marcus, then at the boy still sitting stunned in the grass, brushing dirt from his jeans with hands that hadn't stopped shaking. "You want to know what just happened?" He held back. "That's what you just watched. A man who could have put your friend in a hospital chose not to." Marcus's bravado, so loud and confident just 90 seconds earlier, had evaporated entirely. The phones, still recording, were now capturing something completely different than whatever content the group had imagined they were filming when they'd first circled Walter's bench. Walter Higgins rose from his bench, still visibly shaken but standing now with more steadiness than he'd managed in years. The first time in the entire encounter he'd had the confidence to insert himself directly into what was happening around him. "He didn't start this," Walter said, his voice steadier than he expected it to be. "They took my book. They've bothered me here before, more than once. He just told them to stop." The crowd's attention, which moments earlier had been pointed uncertainly, even fearfully, at the large man who had just put a teenager on the ground, reorganized itself completely around the actual sequence of events, now confirmed independently by both an elderly bystander with nothing to gain from lying and a credentialed former referee whose professional judgment carried immediate, obvious weight. Alan crouched down beside the boy still sitting in the grass and extended a hand, not aggressively, simply offering to help him up, the same open-palmed gesture he'd offered Marcus at the very start of the confrontation. The boy, stunned and clearly frightened now, hesitated only a moment before taking it. "You're not hurt," Alan said, quiet, not unkind, pulling him to his feet with the same careful economy he used lifting furniture 8 hours a day. "That's the only reason I'm not more upset about this than I am. Go home." The teenagers left quickly, quietly, without a trace of the bravado they'd arrived with an hour earlier. Marcus didn't say anything on his way out of the park. Neither did the boy who had thrown the punch, though he glanced back once, briefly, at Alan's face, an expression that looked less like anger now and more like something closer to shame. Frank approached Alan directly, once the group had left the park, the crowd of onlookers beginning to disperse in the specific way crowds do once the interesting part of an event has concluded. "I refereed the Reyes fight," Frank said. "Not an accusation. Simply an honest statement, the specific respect of one professional, acknowledging what he knew to another." Alan was quiet for a moment, his eyes finding Walter's bench across the grass. "I know you did. I always wondered why you walked away right after. Everybody in the sport did." Alan looked toward Walter, who was carefully brushing dirt off the cover of his paperback, with the meticulous care of a man protecting something small and important, settling back onto his bench with hands that had finally, mostly, stopped trembling. "Because I found out exactly what I was capable of," Alan said, "and I decided I didn't want to keep finding that out." Frank absorbed this fully, understanding arriving without requiring further explanation. 3 decades in boxing had taught him more about what happened to Desmond Reyes than most people outside the sport's inner circles ever learned, and taught him, too, the specific silence men in Alan's position often carried afterward. "What you did today," he said finally, "that wasn't the same thing." "No," Alan agreed. "It wasn't." He paused. "But for about half a second, I wasn't sure it wouldn't be." Frank nodded slowly, the specific, quiet nod of a man who understood exactly what that half-second had cost, and did not need it explained further. He extended his hand. Alan shook it. "For what it's worth," Frank said, "you should know that half-second is the whole reason anybody trusted you in that ring in the first place. Same reason to trust you now." Alan didn't answer that directly. He simply nodded once, and turned toward Walter's bench. "You all right?" Alan asked, crossing the grass to where Walter sat, picking up the fallen bag of stale bread from the ground beside the bench, and setting it gently within reach. Walter looked up at him, still shaken but managing something close to a real smile. The first genuine smile he'd allowed himself in this park in longer than he could easily remember. "Better than I've been in a while, actually," he said. "Thank you. I mean that, genuinely." "You don't need to thank me," Alan said. "I know I don't need to," Walter said. "I'm going to anyway." Alan almost smiled at that, the first real softening of his expression since the punch had landed and his hand had risen before he'd fully chosen to move it. "You should probably head home before it gets dark," he said. "I don't think they'll be back." "But just in case." Walter nodded, gathering his paperback and his half-empty bag of bread, standing slowly, steadier now than he had been in years despite the afternoon he'd just had. "Will I see you around here again?" "Same time most days," Alan said. "Same bench works fine for me too, if you don't mind the company." Alan walked the rest of the way home through Riverside Park that evening, the same route he walked nearly every weekday. The same golden late afternoon light filtering through the same familiar trees. Nothing about his ordinary life visibly changed by anything that had just happened. His apartment, his job, his 6 a.m. shifts, his quiet storage unit mornings. All of it was still exactly where he'd left it that morning. But behind him, moving faster through phones and shared videos than anyone in that park could have predicted, a 30-second clip, the single second of a controlled block and redirect, and Frank Delgado's voice saying clearly, "That's Alan Smith, Iron Wall Smith." He could have gone to a world title. He held back, was already reaching people who had never once heard his name before that afternoon, and would not soon forget it now. He didn't know that yet. He wasn't thinking about cameras or clips, or what any of it might mean for the quiet, deliberately unremarkable life he'd spent 8 years building. He was simply walking home, the way he did every single day, carrying the same private weight he had carried since a hospital hallway 8 years ago. A little lighter now, perhaps, for having finally been forced to prove to himself, in the one moment that actually mattered, that restraint was still, completely and truly, who he had chosen to become. If Alan's story stayed with you, if you understand what it costs a man to hold that much strength in reserve, day after day, year after year, share this video right now with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we bring you stories like this one every single week. Hit that like button if this one got you, and drop a comment below, where in the world are you watching from? We read every single one, and we want to know who's out there carrying stories like Alan carried his. Until next time, the strongest thing a person can do is often the thing they choose not to do at all.